All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third installment of Crucial Conversations. We're elated to have some distinguished educators in the city of Springfield that represents over 26,000 students. We're elated to have Superintendent Daniel J. Warwick. We're elated to have school committee member Denise Hurst, and we're also elated to have school committee woman LaTonia Monroe Naylor. And you also have some great news that you do on the state level. What is that?
Absolutely. Well, first I have to say thank you to Denise Hurst because she sits on the board for the Mass Association for School Committees, and she informed me of an opening for the Minority Caucus, and I applied for it, and I was so happy to be able to get it. So I am now the Secretary-Treasurer for the Minority Caucus, which is part of the board of the Mass Association for School Committees.
Man, congratulations to that.
Thank
you for representing the great city of Springfield and the entire Commonwealth. And so we appreciate the work you do and the service you do. Superintendent Warwick, the first question is just around how important during this season of the pandemic are conversations like this?
Yeah, I'm so grateful for you for hosting this event. Thank you, Pastor. I think these conversations are crucial. You know, there's a lot of communication that's needed, and when we don't have a lot of communication, there's miscommunication that goes on, and we were talking about that earlier. So I think to get as much information as we can out, and then to have a constructive dialogue around what's going on is so important in these stressful times.
Ms. Hurst.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with the superintendent. It's crucial and very critical that our communities have all of the information that they need so that they can plan accordingly. When this pandemic hit, I don't think any of us could have ever expected that months later we'd still be sort of trying to figure out how we proceed in our day-to-day. And I think that we have families who depend on the school district for a variety of reasons, and we need to ensure that they have the most accurate information so that they can plan to the best of their ability. So thank you for hosting this conversation, because it absolutely is critical.
Do you want to add anything?
I echo their sentiments. It is extremely important for the community to be informed, to be educated, not just academically, but also in civics and also just community-wide. Understanding what it is that they can do to support their families and how can they also support those that are in their community who also need support.
Thank you. So to our listening audience, you can find us on Facebook. If you're there, you can go to our website, wearemountzion.com. Also, you can find us on YouTube. So those are three different ways in which you can find us in this conversation. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can submit questions during this conversation so that we can ask these distinguished educators within our city so that we can get clarity around several issues and topics that we'll discuss on this evening. So please like and share tonight's conversation so that we can get the message out to people throughout the city to know or to better understand what's happening within our school district and department during this difficult season that we call the pandemic. So the first question or the first topic of discussion, this past Saturday, hundreds of youth gathered at one of our high schools in protest for resource officers being in school, and they deemed it police officers being in school. And I want to take a whole step back and just ask you, Superintendent Warwick, what is the role of resource officers within our schools?
Yeah, thank you, Pastor. I think the overall role obviously is a safety role, trying to make sure we have the safety and security. As we know, in this country, we've had some serious issues in some schools, and we're trying to avoid that, make sure our kids are safe when they're at school. We've had a Quebec team, we call the Quebec team here in Springfield, they're school resource officers, for about 25 years. And they were put in place. We had a terrible tragedy with Reverend Brown some 20 years or so ago up at the academy next to Van Sickle. And they were put in response to make sure the students are safe. The role is not disciplinary in nature. That's the role of the school staff. The role is there to be there for safety and to maintain that kind of, should we have a serious situation, be able to respond to it before it's too late. They've looked at the serious issues across the country, and a few minutes is crucial when a serious issue occurs. So having that officer there and trained and ready to respond to protect our kids is so important.
What are your opinions around the protests that occurred? I know we want to hear the voices of students. Is it wise to remove the resource officers or the Quebec team out of the schools? Is it, because I know we had some incidents where there were some kids who were roughed up, et cetera, in the last couple of years. So the concerns of the kids are serious. Some people feel as if they shouldn't be armed. And in the news, one of the kids said that, hey, they look as if we're in jail or something. So what are your opinions around the resource officers in school or the police in school?
So I'll take that one. So I think it's a really complex issue. Quite frankly, I don't think that there is one perfect solution, quite honestly, and I've had this conversation with the superintendent and with other colleagues on the school committee and with actually community members. So to your first point, I think that it's important to acknowledge the students that put that protest together. I think it's important to hear their voices and get a better understanding of why they feel the way that they do, what are some of the solutions that they might be proposing. But I also think that it's really important, especially considering that emotions are running high and people are upset and they are frustrated. And I know that we sit here as school committee members, but we're also parents. And I, in particular, and LaTonia, are parents of Black boys or Black girls. And for me, as a mother and a school committee member, I approach the situation with a variety of different lenses or a variety of different hats. And so, yes, I want to make sure that when I send my kids to school, they're safe, that their teachers feel safe, right? We want them to be able to focus on educating our children. But I also don't want my child to be fearful that if he engages in an age-appropriate activity that might be deemed disruptive, that he's going to be potentially punished, by the police. So I do believe that we have good school resource officers or a good Quebec team. I do believe that this is the time to sort of look and figure out where can we get better, how can we get better, and before we make any, really big decisions, I think we need to hear more from our community. And I also think that we need to really look at some evidence-based models that might be happening in other districts, and what can we take from that and ensure that we implement it in our district so that kids, teachers, families feel safe.
Absolutely. I think, to piggyback on what you just said, Denise, that it's really important to get the pulse of everyone in the community. And so oftentimes, some kids may be in certain schools or may have had certain experiences that have led them to feel a certain way. But also, there's other students that love to have their resource officer in the building. They've told us that they have a rapport with them and they're a mentor to them. And so to generalize it and base it on a few officers that didn't do what they were supposed to do according to their roles and responsibility in the building and according to what our memorandum of understanding says, I think it's not a wise decision to then say, let's get them all out. I think that if you don't have a replacement as to how you're going to protect those students and those staff so that we don't have another Reverend Brown, God rest his soul, who was just trying to do the right thing and unfortunately wasn't trained and prepared for what happened as a result of a student having weapons. So when you think about the fact that, people say, well, it's a problem and they shouldn't be there, but they're not the ones who are in the schools when somebody brings a gun in or somebody brings in a knife, right? And it happens. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. Do I want my teacher to have to be responsible to deal with that student? Absolutely not. Do I want a student to accidentally be injured or intentionally injured by someone who means to do them harm and there's not a police officer for 7 or 8 minutes because there's nobody in the building? Absolutely not. So I say to those people who are questioning or saying that we need to just get them all out, give me a solution that is going to allow my children and other children that look like them to feel safe when they're the reality is there are gangs. There are children that are feeling unsafe. And until they get to school, that's when they feel safe, right? So I think it's very important to not just say, end all, or take somebody's perspective who doesn't live in our community or hasn't lived the experience of what a lot of our families live, and then make a judgment as to what to do. And also the reason why I say that is one of our partners in the community was advocating heavily, saying, these resource officers contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline. But then they asked their parents, what do you want? And most of the parents said, no, we don't want them out of the building. We just want to make sure they're not there doing inappropriate activity and they're not there to harm our kids. So when you go back to the question of how is it that they're supposed to act in that building and what are they supposed to respond to, and if they're behaving inappropriately, are we then addressing that? Or are they not trained appropriately to be in the building dealing with our kids? Those are different conversations than saying take them all out or have them all in. It's really, we got to read between the lines. And so I would never say let's do an end all, be all. I would say let's look at it from different perspectives at different levels and better understand what is working and then also what is not working.
Could I add to that, Pastor? I also think it's really, if we look at it from a macro level, I think it's also really important to recognize that one of the things that we would like to see come out of this, out of all of it, not just the SROs, but even our current local police department, is to strengthen relationships. And if our children don't have an opportunity to positively engage with a police officer in a school, which is supposed to be a safe environment, how are they going to do that in the community, right? Are they going to be so fearful because they never, ever get an opportunity to interact with them? So I do think that we need to figure out, how do we strengthen that relationship? How do we acknowledge that the school-to-prison pipeline is something that does exist, and we want to ensure that we don't contribute to that? And how do we ensure that the school resource officers that we have want to be there, want to be an advocate, want to be a friend, and want to be a resource to our students. So I think that that's really, really important, and I don't think we can lose sight of that.
If I could just add something, I think Denise made a great point there. A big piece of it has been the relationship building between the resource officers and the students. And by and large, overall, over the years, it's been very, very positive. The community should look at the police as someone they can go to, someone they can feel comfortable with. And that relationship building has been very, very positive overall. And I think that's very important, and I think we need to build on it. We've really emphasized, as Denise and LaTonia know, in our MOU every year, increasing the training, diversity training, training in various ways, training in special education so they know the student populations, but training so that the resource officers can function more effectively. And that's what we should be working towards, getting them to function effectively to actually act in the role in the way we really need them to. And we've worked hard to try to improve that training and improve the support so that we can have those positive interactions. But in talking to our secondary principals, they unilaterally said that the biggest positive is the relationship building that has occurred, and that they become part of the fabric of the team at the schools. And they're involved in a lot more than just the safety element, and forming those relationships and being part of the staff so that we can have a positive relationship with our kids. And another piece that LaTonia added is the kids really need to feel safe in school. We need to make sure that we're a safe haven for our kids. And that's what we need to work to. I don't think any program is perfect, but we have worked really hard to improve the training and support to make sure the unit functions as it ought to as part of the building.
And if I may add just one more thing as well, when you look at the numbers from 2012 or so, when a lot of people started to track the arrests, the numbers have decreased substantially. And the reason why is because when people spoke, we listened, right? And I think it's important for people to understand that the MOU has changed. It's been updated, that we have made mandates, that we are reminding administrators that police officers in your building are not there to discipline the children. They are there for safety. Do not call them if a kid drops a pencil on the floor or if they don't want to listen to you right now, because that's not their job. It's your job to figure out how to get that student to do whatever it is that you're asking them to do. And so I think along with the training of the resource officers comes about a training for our administrators and our staff. And I think as we start to move towards the conversation around diversity, a lot of those conversations that need to be had around fragility and implicit bias and misunderstanding culture and misappropriating what certain things mean, because you take it from your own culture and you think it means one thing and now you're offended and now the kid is suspended. So those kinds of things have to happen on both sides as well, because I think for the officers to be able to do their job effectively, they also have to know they're in a building where they know how they're supposed to be utilized and they're not called on in situations that are not appropriate for them to respond to.
So let me ask this question. One of our Facebook listeners, I'll put it in context for clarity's sake. The question is around why were no regulations or restrictions placed on the resource officers being in schools. The contract gives them full power with zero restrictions regarding students. So I don't know if that's accurate or true, but if one of you can add clarity around the restrictions for the resource officers.
So there are a lot of restrictions. Number one, they can't get involved in just disciplinary matters at the school. That's not their role. LaTonia said that very well. We've also had to train our staff when to involve the police and when not to involve the police. And that's a crucial situation. We had a situation at Kylie a few years ago, and the truth was that the resource officer wasn't being used the right way. But that's staff training. So as part of our MOU, we've not only trained the police officers, we've provided a lot of training for our staff so that they're actually using the police officers the right way. I think that's very, very important. But they're definitely there for safety, but they're there when there's a crime occurring and something that really needs to be dealt with, but they're not to deal with discipline. And anytime we've had a problem, we've immediately had the resource officer removed from the unit. So, we monitor it closely, we provide a lot of training, but we don't tolerate any, if we see something that's inappropriate, we deal with it right away and get them out of the unit so that we can move forward productively.
Okay. So the last question around this, so the MOU that you guys refer to, is there a place where the general public, we can read it and educate ourselves on it? Or is it not a public document?
I believe it's a public document.
Okay.
Yeah, all of our contracts and everything can be made public, so it is a public document, and anyone who wanted a copy of it we could get access to it.
Okay.
No problem.
I think it's really important for folks to be able to see that MOU and for there to be a real high level of transparency, because I think that that's the only way at this particular moment that we're going to be able to build trust or rebuild that trust, because I do understand that people are feeling, very, again, frustrated and angry and betrayed. And so I do think that it's our responsibility to be accountable and to provide that transparency, and we should be able to provide it. It's a public document.
Absolutely, it's a public document. Can make it available to anyone who wants it. And one thing we've done is by improving in every contract, and we've done several contracts, and every time we put a contract forward, we look at it and try to improve things. We've really radically improved the training for the police officers, so there's a lot of mandated training that has to occur for every police officer. We have them go through the Crisis Prevention Institute, which is a lot of de-escalation, verbal, nonverbal de-escalation, all kinds of techniques that can help you resolve difficult matters and not get hands-on. So that kind of training has improved things, but the arrests are less than 10% of what they were 10 years ago. So you can see the arrests have gone down, and the incidents in the buildings and the suspensions and the discipline referrals are also way down. We've emphasized a lot of things besides just the school resource officers. You know, we've put programs in like positive behavior intervention supports to better deal with student behavior. We've invested heavily in our counselors. We have more adjustment counselors in our schools than Boston does, which is a very well-funded school system. We've also invested in City Connects to really try to solve the mental health issues that lead to some of the acting out behavior that then can lead to problematic arrest situations. So we've been trying to be proactive, and we've invested a lot more in the proactive programs and the mental health services than we have in the school resource team, because we're trying to attack the problem proactively.
I will also add to that that we could find the best training in the world and implement every single intervention that we possibly could. But it comes back to also the officer, that individual officer being able to make the right decision and understanding his or her role. And we can't guarantee perfection, but we can strive for it. And if and when that officer isn't living up to what it is that they're supposed to do, then it's on us to ensure that they are not in our district or in our school system. And better yet, if there's issues around them being in our district as an SRO, then there's probably a larger issue that needs to be looked at from the department.
All right, so
Can I say one last
go
thing?
ahead.
One last thing. It's just to wrap it up. I just would encourage students and educators and families that if you are having issues, please let your administrator know. Please let the superintendent know. Send that complaint up the ranks. Do not just settle for inappropriate behavior and just sweep it under the rug and just say that's how it is. Make it loud and clear that it will not be accepted. Because until such a time that we make a decision, and if we ever make a decision to completely move them out, they're there. And some of them may still get the training and respond in a way that's inappropriate. And if they do that, we need to know about it. And so I just wanted to say that very clearly and loudly for folks to hear.
All right, great. Thank you guys for that segment. The next segment, I want to ask you, Denise, if I may call you Denise.
Yes.
Thank you. So I want to ask you
please
this.
do.
Right. I was going to call her Mrs. Hurst the whole night, right? So the question I have, yesterday, Mayor Sarno, Dominic Sarno, the mayor of our city, he came out and he declared racism a public health crisis, which was very, very good. And he made a lot of great statements and overtures towards the African American community and communities of color. The question I have as it relates to education, how do we recruit and retain teachers and staff of color within our school system?
So I think that there's a couple of different ways to approach that particular recruitment effort or retention effort. You know, I think that it's incumbent upon us to begin to have those conversations with the students that we currently have in our district at a really young age. The idea that the recruitment and retention of teachers of color being just a shortage in Springfield is not accurate. It's something that is happening across the country. It's not a field that many folks are going into, or if they are, they're going into them later on in life as a second career, which is also fantastic. But I do think that we need to put the same emphasis on being a teacher that we do on becoming a doctor or becoming a lawyer. Doctors and lawyers can't become doctors and lawyers unless they have a teacher. So I do think that we have to really help to support the field, and we have to help, you know, really lift the field up so that people see it as more than just a noble profession, but as a profession that's absolutely needed. And so I think that we can do a lot of things here in the district, right? We can be really creative, which we have, in recruiting teachers. We used to do the historically black colleges and universities. We used to go to Puerto Rico to recruit. So I think looking at those particular types of measures is really helpful. I also think We have programs at Westfield State, Springfield College, that is helping to sort of defer the cost and bring people back to teaching here in the district. And I also think that there's something special about being able to be mentored by someone that you've had as a teacher. So if we're having students come back to the district to be teachers, let's pair them with somebody who was, might have been their teacher, or ensure that they have access to someone who has come through the same district as them, who's able to talk about the challenges, but yet the benefits of being in the district, to help keep them so that they don't, want to go down the way to Hartford or, to Boston, but that they see Springfield as a real viable place to stay and teach because it gave them so much.
And within that same school of thought, so there, within the media, it's focusing a lot on African American history that has been lost or not taught in school, that has not been passed down in a constructive way. For instance, the world will celebrate Juneteenth for probably the first time, but it's if you're from the South and places where I am, it's a familiar occurrence. And I know we have a Juneteenth festival here, a gathering here in the city of Springfield. How important is it to update the curriculum to make sure it emphasizes history of people of color?
I think that is extremely important. And one of the things that's coming down the pike, because people are starting to understand the value and making sure that everyone is aware of the real history of this country. And I think you cannot have a conversation about U.S. history without talking about Black history and the important people that have contributed to this country and building this country and really helping it to become what it is today. And then also speaking to the unjust behaviors that people have pitted against Black people for generations, and what that looks like and why it continues to be an issue up until now. So I think it's very important that these conversations are happening, not just for kids who are of color, but for folks who are not, to understand what the struggle is. And when we talk about the struggle of being a Black woman in America, that they understand what that really means. Because oftentimes people look at it and go, oh, you're just dramatic, oh, you're just aggressive, oh, you're just, being a whatever. But the reality is there's a lot of baggage that comes with being a person of color in this country. And so I think that it will not be the be-all, end-all, but I think that it opens up a window for people to see more into our life and what we've been through, what our struggle is, but also how do we continue to move forward and not repeat the history. Because if you don't know the history, then you can't make sure that you don't repeat that history, and you don't understand why things were, and then you can't understand how things are going to be a different way and a better way. So yes, it's imperative.
Again, we're constantly trying to update the curriculum and take a look at a more culturally responsive curriculum, but we've really done a lot, especially in social studies, in updating that curriculum and making sure that we do have offerings, but within the regular courses that we're also recognizing all the groups that make up this country. That wasn't always the case in a lot of the national curriculums, but when we buy a curriculum, we make sure before we purchase the curriculum, we're looking at that cultural responsiveness.
So I think that when I hear about our mayor and the mayors across the Commonwealth and across the country that have declared racism its own pandemic or its own crisis, I think that we also then have to think about, like LaTonia said, how do we ensure that people understand the systemic and institutional racism that is alive and well? And then how do we change our policies and practices to eradicate those particular practices? Because we can declare it, but then if we don't do anything about it, where does that leave us? And just to circle back to the question that you asked me about how do we recruit and retain teachers, I think that one of the policies that has to be looked at probably by the state legislature or the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is the actual licensing requirements and how that hinders people of color from passing and getting their licensure to actually teach. And so I do think that there are some real pieces of legislation and policies that have to be looked at and eradicated if we really are going to combat this crisis.
I'd like to support Denise in that. When you look at the MTEL, the test for licensure, the passing rates among minorities are very low, so that the minorities can't even get licensed to actually teach. So we can't hire them unless they have the licensure. So that's been a real barrier, and it's something they control at the state level. We've talked across the state with our state associations about it and fought it. I've talked to the commissioner about it, but it really has to change because you can see across the state this is a serious issue, and we know we have to recruit more minority teachers, so we have to really take a look at those policies and really insist that they change at the state level because we need radical change there.
And I'm really excited that the Mass Association of School Committees has put out a statement, and thankful for our chair of our minority caucus who really pressed the issue and said, are you going to speak to this issue that happened with George Floyd and some of this systemic racism that is happening in our country currently, but forever has been happening. And we were able to see a statement come out from the board, really indicating, that declaration almost of, we are fighting against racism and we want to see systemic change in our state and in our educational system. And school committees across the state have been signing on unanimously in most towns and cities on resolutions to really talk about updating policies, really reviewing them to make sure that there aren't any gaps or holes, and if there are gaps and holes that are contributing to institutional racism, that we start to eradicate and update those policies, but also implementing curriculum that will allow us to look at the historical context and be more culturally sensitive and aware, provide that awareness for folks, and a lot of other things as well. But I think those two pieces really stand out for me because we haven't had these conversations so fluidly and so openly and unapologetically in such a long time. And so I'm really excited about this movement and this momentum, and I'm hoping that, like Denise said, it's not just going to be a declaration, but also some actionable steps that we're going to take to make sure that we are in fact moving the needle forward.
Great. So let's segue the conversation a little bit more. I serve as the vice chair for Savas International Charter School here in the city. And I know the conversations we've been having for the past 3-4 months now as it relates to the pandemic in education. And I say it because I'm also a community member, I'm also a pastor, but I'm in these conversations where the brightest people in the room, we aren't quite prepared for a pandemic. And it's good to be transparent enough to say we're all kind of getting through this together and learning together, and we're coming up with the best strategies and the best plans of action for how to best educate our students. So the 2021 school year is approaching, and I want to just ask a general question. What is the overall thinking for students returning to school in the fall? I'll start with you, Superintendent.
Thank you, Pastor. So I will tell you that we're putting a tremendous amount of energy and thought into how we're going to properly organize and orchestrate that return to school. We know kids need to return to school. We know how important it is to have that, face-to-face interaction with the teachers. So we're working hard on that. The commissioner at DESE has had meetings with us. We've been attending regularly and has a task force looking at that at the state level. He has epidemiologists on the task force as well as educators. He has the teachers union representatives, parents. And we have an administrative team in Springfield that's taken a look at all of the factors that go into this. What are we going to have to purchase for PPEs, which is rather extensive, but we're going to do everything we can. Again, when we reopen, our kids are going to be safe. We're going to have the right PPEs we need. We're going to have the right numbers of students in the classrooms. I think it's hard to speculate how things are going to open, but I think my best guess and understanding based on all the conversations I've had is there'll be some kind of hybrid model when we reopen in the fall. Again, I think the commissioner is going to make a statewide recommendation on that after having put a tremendous amount of thought into it. And Commissioner Riley was Assistant Superintendent in Boston and Superintendent in Lawrence. So he has that urban experience, and I think a lot of times we have the larger schools, and we have larger schools, more concentrations of students. So he has a good feel of what the issue's all about, and he's been meeting with us regularly. When I say a hybrid model, I think you're going to see a reduced number of students in the classrooms at a time, and some, maybe like a group A, group B, half the students coming in on a daily basis and half the students staying remote, and rotating them in for like half time. That way we'd be able to do the appropriate social distancing. So, if we went by the thought that Commissioner Riley's team is putting forth, right now that's what they're leaning to. But I think what's very important is that there are going to be families, and we understand that don't feel comfortable yet with any kind of return. And I've heard estimates of somewhere between 20 and 40% that could say, we want to stay remote. And for families that want to stay remote, we're going to honor that. We're going to make sure that we continue to provide the education we can remotely. And then for students whose parents want them to return, we'll honor that as well and bring them in as regularly as we can and organize it as safely as we can. It's quite an endeavor. It's a logistical nightmare, if you will, to think about not just the classroom, the buses. When you can only have so many students on a bus and the social distancing requirements. But we've got to make sure we maintain, safety on those buses. Where you see communities that rely heavily on public transportation, that's been something that's a real concern. So there's a lot of issues that we have to look into. We're also going to ask families, if you want your student to return, but if we understand if you don't want them to come in on public transportation, so they'd have the opportunity to drop the students off as well. So we're going to talk to every family from every school and see what they're looking for and try to design it around those needs. But again, certainly would be a reduced population in the school every day, and we'll organize it accordingly and take a look at our teaching staff and how we can keep the remote learning going and the live instruction going as well.
So will there be a unified plan from the Commonwealth, from Commissioner Riley, passed down to every school district?
The commissioner's leaning towards a pretty prescriptive plan. Haven't completely formulated it yet. May give us some options, but there's going to be requirements that, the health departments are going to weigh in and say, you have to have these requirements. So it's going to build in all of that. And again, he has the epidemiologists on his team. And then we'll probably have some options within those plans. Definitely wants to see the kids come back, if we can, for some live instruction as much as possible. And we do too. We know the kids need that. So we're going to make every effort to provide what we can, but again, ensuring safety. In Springfield, we're very lucky. About 5 years ago, with the support of the school committee, and in very, very difficult budget times, we made a sacrifice in many other areas to actually go one-to-one with laptops for our students and really buy the infrastructure, take care of the infrastructure needs. So we actually had laptops to go out to all of our students and really had provided 5 years worth of professional development for our teachers on how to use technology for instruction, which is crucial in this endeavor. So we were better off in Springfield than most other communities. My friend Maureen Benny-Endy in Worcester and I were talking one day. They didn't have any laptops in Worcester, so they're still doing work packets out of their feeding centers. So not everyone had invested in the technology, but we made sacrifices, and the school committee was very supportive in some really tough budget situations to actually invest heavily in technology. And I'd like to say we did that knowing a pandemic was coming, but that wouldn't be true. We knew that the kids would benefit from the technology in the classroom, and it would help with the instruction. But during this pandemic, it's really paid dividends and proved to be a very wise decision.
And I would say, too, when you think about the benefits of the hybrid model, hopefully, that we will have, or even just the past couple of months, and I know for many parents, they're like probably laughing at me right now because it has been hectic trying to learn how to get into Teams and to Class Dojo or Remind or whatever it is that the kids were using at your particular school. And I have 4 that were at 4 different schools, so it was for me, woo, like my head spinning all the time. But I said that to say that it also has opened up opportunities to rethink how do we teach our kids, right? Rethink the creativity of engaging children with technology and how do you do that. And so I was on a call yesterday with one of my kids' school and a bunch of other parents, and we had some really good conversation and good feedback from for the team as to what worked and what didn't work. What would we like to see happen? And I think those conversations are happening at a lot of our schools. And so I encourage families to also, if there's not already an opportunity presented for them, to inquire about an opportunity to be able to give that feedback besides a survey, because I think everybody's asked to fill out a survey, but it's something to be said about being able to articulate your words to someone and expand on why you said something or what it is that you had to deal with and why it impacted you in a certain way. Because at the end of the day, in order for them to create a plan that's going to be beneficial to all children, we need to hear from all families as much as possible so that nobody is left out. I remember when we started the food program, there were a lot of little things that happened, and we were like so excited that we started the food program, and then we had people calling us like, well, what about people who are special needs and they're over 18? And it was like, so we had to constantly go back and forth with the state and deal with different regulations to make sure that we were doing what we needed to do according to the state requirements and mandates, but also being able to service all of our students and our families. And so as things proceeded, you know, things got better, but I think the important thing is we have the whole summer to really rethink strategy and really invest in that planning process, and it can't happen effectively without the voice of the parents and without the voices of the students.
I would add that you started this off by asking how important are these conversations, and I think that the return to school in August is really important. It's an important conversation to have. And I know and I appreciate all the work that the superintendent and his staff are doing to prepare for our kids to come back and that the commissioner is doing. But I have to be honest and say that I have a great deal of pause and concern, because I have to acknowledge that and I don't want to speak for LaTonia, but we have some level of privilege and resource, and not all of our families do. And that, I think, worries me, and I think that when and how we roll out the communication is going to be really critical, because we know how to pick up the phone and call and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, my son didn't get this, we need this. Not every parent does. Not every parent has the capacity to do that. We also know that our school district is majority students of color, and we know that the pandemic has affected communities of color at a ravaging rate. And so I guess I get nervous about how are we going to ensure that those most vulnerable kids get what it is that they need. I almost feel like it's like we're gonna have to like knock on the door when we're campaigning, like, listen, tell your neighbor that, you know, this is when school is going to start, this is what the schedule is going to look like. Because I don't know, Superintendent, if you would agree, but, you know, it can be chaos when we call a half day for a snowstorm. Never mind a family having to try and remember when, you know, when it's their child's turn to go to school that week, and especially if they have more than one. So I get nervous, and I know that we're doing it with the best intentions, but I really get nervous because our kids need to have access to an education.
I think you make a great point there, and I think that's that parent perspective is really critically important. So what we decided to do when the commissioner recommended a survey, I talked to staff, and we've asked our school staff to reach out to the families and have a conversation. And say, look, if we were to come back in this manner, we're not sure, but, you know, would you be open to sending your child back on a part-time basis? Would you rather remote only? What about the transportation, that kind of thing? So we actually had a conversation with each parent. And during the situation, during the spring semester, if you will, what we've done from each school is we've looked at all our kids that are participating heavily and engaging with the teachers, which is great, and many of our kids are, but there were a lot of families that were having more difficulty with that. And we created a log of effort so that each school reached out. So if a student or the family wasn't participating, in one log I looked at, the different staff members reached out 6 times. You know, one time it was a teacher, another time it was a different teacher, then a counselor, then an administrator, just reaching out to find a way to help that family engage or help them through these problems, because what the families are facing during a pandemic like this is a host of issues. There's a host of mental health issues that we're facing. So during the crisis, we also had our counselors and our City Connect staff and our teachers reaching out and trying to help people navigate those issues as well, because they're rather significant. And you know, and it's that personal outreach from people you know and trust in the school that makes a difference. And we worked hard to really improve the engagement, but also improve the communication and let the families know we really care and we want to make sure they're okay. And our level of participation during the pandemic, because of that, I think was significantly higher than a lot of other urban areas.
And definitely we want to make sure that we are not losing sight of the reality that, you know, many parents are in positions working as essential employees and whatnot, and they're not able to be home with their kids during the day, right? And so to Denise's point, I remember being home because I was able to work remotely, and even with that, I still had to remind my kids every hour, like, did you do your work? Let me check it. Let me see what's going on. And so I can only imagine a family who had to be out of the home during the day and expecting their child to do the work. And so that's why I continue to always push that necessity for families to advocate, or people to advocate on behalf of people who are not able to or don't know how to. Because if we don't make sure that those voices, those stories are being told and that they're being heard, then we can't create change, right? And so I use the example about the food. If we didn't have folks reaching out and saying, hey, what about people who are working during the day and they can't get to the school? Well, then we were able to come up with a strategy to make sure that those kids could still get food, right? But if we don't know about that story, how do we think about it? And if we're not living that every day, then it's not easy for us to come up with the story to say, maybe somebody's in this situation. And so oftentimes being a parent allows us the leniency to have different perspectives of what folks can be going through. And so I oftentimes, when I talk to the different educators at my kids' schools, I would say, you know, I'm having this problem. Only imagine what so-and-so or this person might be dealing with, and helping them to really think about, now, what are you going to do about it? Like putting the onus back on them. And so just like we ask folks who have privilege, you know, white privilege, for example, we say, you speak up on behalf of those that don't. Well, I think the same thing needs to happen for those of us that have the privilege or know how to advocate or know how to go in and have certain conversations, that we're bringing those issues to the forefront and not only waiting for people to say it for themselves, but making sure it's intentional, that we're having those conversations with folks that may not be privy to or aware of some of the struggles that folks are dealing with in our communities.
So I think when we were getting the meals program going, LaTonia made a good point. You know, when some school committee members reached out to me, there were certain neighborhoods we had, every neighborhood was covered, but there were some neighborhoods where some people were having trouble getting to one of the sites, and Denise called me or LaTonia called me. So we went from 13 to 18 sites, but we helped them navigate that. Since school closed, we've actually delivered 1,200,000 meals to families. So no school department of Commonwealth has come anywhere near that, but we listened, we responded, and we created a program. And during the summer, we're going to keep those 17 sites that are open every day and Central on Friday open, and we're going to continue the meal distribution program, because these are very trying times, and we want to make sure we meet the needs of our families.
Absolutely. That's extremely commendable, extremely commendable. The question I have, and I'm putting all of you on the spot, will you come back later in the summer once the plan is in place for the reopening of schools and have another conversation with us?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, and I do think that we could help. I'm volunteering as Zell superintendent, but I do think that, you know, there might be a way for us to sort of really ensure that it gets widespread coverage, because it's going to be it's hard to get information to 26,000 students and their families. So absolutely.
No, I would love to, and I thank you for hosting this tonight, because I think this communication's essential. I think Gazelle's worked very, very hard on our communication strategy, and we'll continue to do that. And any ideas everyone has, we'd be glad to push them out, because you can never communicate enough. I always say to staff, 7 times, 7 ways, and that's what you need to do. So we'd love to do that, or I'd love to do that.
Thank you, guys. So with the last moments we have, I want to talk about the summer, right? Are there summer enrichment programs that are still happening, and how can parents prepare their students for the return of school in the fall? So that's a 2-part question.
So it's a great question, very, very timely. So we've spent the last 2 months planning summer programming because we knew it was going to be absolutely vital. So what we actually did this year was add to our summer programming. We have a large array of summer programs at every level. We have a tremendous course recovery program at the high school level. So any student who didn't pass a particular course, we make sure they have a chance in the summer to retake that course. So all of those programs are going to still be available at every school. We have programs at the middle school for course recovery. We also have some basic skills programs at the elementary level that we run every year. But in addition to it this year, and we decided when we looked at things and listened to everyone, that clearly the best way to operate this summer was follow through on our remote plan. We've already distributed 17,000 laptops to families. Leave them out there for the families to use, and actually let everyone engage in those programs. But I also spent an extra $250,000 on running an enrichment program for everyone who wants to participate. So open to everyone, and we'll be getting information out on that to everyone so that everyone can participate. And we're looking at putting some prizes in place, for kids who submit their work and actually participate, to reward them for sticking with it over the summer. But certainly with this transition we went through and getting all the laptops out, there was some learning loss. So this summer piece is absolutely vital. And it's going to be all remote, but we put a tremendous amount of effort into it and actually expanded the options for families. But every family can participate, and if a family still doesn't have a laptop, we still have them available at the schools for anyone who needs them. All they have to do is call the school.
And how can parents prepare their youth, their children, for the upcoming school year? Or what things can the parents do to keep their students engaged during the summer months?
Depending on how old your child is, I think it's probably going to be really important to have a conversation about how school is going to look differently. I think that when we stopped in March, it was really abrupt, and there was a lot of fear. I have a 4-year-old who, just asked my mother this today, when is the coronavirus going to be over? And so I do think that it's important for us to have those conversations and try and explain as much as possible in terms that might be understandable by them. And I also think that parents need to be able to give themselves and their kids a break, but have a commitment to trying to engage in the summer to have some level of consistency, because it's hard. And to LaTonia's point, my husband and I both work, and it was really difficult. And we could sit the 9-year-old and say, okay, this is the class schedule for the week, but we had to really engage with the preschooler, and that was really hard to do in between Zoom calls. And so I do think we're not able to go out the way that we used to. They're not in sports and in camps. So I do think that we have to have some realistic expectations and be able to give folks a break, and then be able to come back and figure out what works for our families. And then to really have those conversations with others who might be having a more difficult time, to sort of encourage and figure out, what might work for them, and build on those particular strengths, rather than just say, you need to make sure that your kid does the summer school programming. That may not work, right? That, all or nothing approach. So I think we too have to be really flexible in how we move forward, and prepare for the end of August.
And I would definitely add that, first of all, I would say cherish this time. This is a time unlike any other, right? There are limited opportunities for our kids to be engaged outside of the home and for us to be engaged outside of the home. So I think it's important that parents cherish this time, but also make sure they're giving themselves little mini vacations during the day. Take a walk, do something. Because kids can stress you out and make you want to pull your hair out. And we don't want you doing that. But I think when you cherish the time and then you start to think about, knowing that next year is going to be different and the new normal is still up in the air because we're trying to figure out what that is, that you also think about your family unit and what is it that you all can do to build that mission or that vision for your own family, and how do you set up a plan of habit, right, where everyone is on a schedule, and start thinking about that now. Take a break from school and stuff, because I'm telling you, I've been there and done that. I'm on a break right now. Don't give me any summer enrichment activities for at least 2 or 3 weeks. But I think it's important that they have that break, but also understand the importance of academics, and that it's not a vacation that your kids are at home. They're not home to vacate and play Xbox or whatever, but they're there and expected to still engage in an educational process. And why is that important? And talk to your kids about why that is important, right? Because if you don't have those conversations and value it and understand why we need to have education, then when the fall comes, people might still perceive it as another vacation, and that's not what it is. So sometimes it's as simple as, sitting back, relaxing, and really rethinking that strategy in a home. We don't get the opportunity to do that when we're running and hustling and bustling and being a soccer mom and a basketball mom and all of that. And so now I can sit down with my children and learn of them and have conversation with them that I never could have before, and understand their personality and allow them to ask me questions that are fruitful, cook dinner together, and be able to sit down together at the table and have really meaningful and valuable conversation. And what folks often forget, those conversations can be priceless, and those can impact our kids for generations literally to come. Some of the things that my Nana told me, I remember to this day, right, because of conversation. So I, kind of steering away from the direction of education for just a second, would say those are the things that we want to focus on over the summer, and not lose sight of those important things.
Right. So the last question for me is this. For our children and youth who are watching tonight's crucial conversation, what's a word of encouragement you can speak to them?
You all are making history. You are going to really be a part of history, because this is something that none of us have ever experienced. And I would say continue to try and do your best, and to reach out to your friends and ask them to do their very best.
I'd like to say I'm very, very proud of our kids and their families. I think in the last few weeks we've had some peaceful protests here in Springfield, and our kids helped organize those protests. And I was very, very proud that they're engaged, they're speaking out, they're community-minded. And I've been very, very proud of our kids during this pandemic, how they've stepped up and really tried to engage across the city, and to keep it up. And like LaTonia and Denise said it so well when I was over-stressing the summer school, that enjoy your summer too. Take that time, take that family time. One thing that's been nice to see is families taking walks in our neighborhoods, families out riding bikes. So do a little work, but then enjoy the summer and get out and enjoy that family time together. But for our kids that have stepped up and engaged in some of the protests in a very articulate manner and in a very forthright manner, we're very, very proud of them for stepping up and working to make our community a better community for everyone.
I would just say, don't be silent. And when I say don't be silent, I'm saying not just with your mouths, but with your actions. And let those actions be love. Every day, everything that you do, let it be in the spirit of love, and really understanding that this is a defining moment in our history of our country, but also for our race as a human race. Like, this is a defining moment. And I think if we choose to love you know, and walking that and talking that is the only thing that's going to make this country and this world better. And I know it sounds Pollyannish, but I think people have forgotten the value of love and how it overcomes hate every time. And when you do that, the frustration and the heartache and the angst and the anxiety that people are experiencing right now doesn't really matter as much, because you don't take those things as heavily, because you're operating from a different perspective. So that is what I would say. Just continue to be that action verb of love.
Excellent. Thank you, school committee member LaTonia Monroe Naylor, Superintendent Daniel J. Warwick, and school committee member Denise Hurst. Thank you guys for joining us this evening. Thank you to our Facebook, YouTube, and our website audience. Next week, we have another great, crucial conversation next week at 7 p.m., so we invite you to tune in. And we look forward to later in this summer, once the plan is in place, we'll have this distinguished panel come back and really speak to what school will look like in the fall. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the balance of your week. Go in peace, and may the God of peace go with you.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yes, thank you very much.